Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order by Ray Dalio. Introduction. Imagine you're a young, ambitious clerk on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. It's a hot summer day, August 15, 1971. The air is electric with the thrill of the game, fortunes made and lost in the blink of an eye. You're just 22 years old, and you think you're starting to figure out how the world works. Then, that Sunday night, you're watching television. President Richard Nixon appears on the screen and makes a stunning announcement. He declares that the United States will no longer honor its promise to exchange its paper dollars for gold. In that moment, you realize something profound has just happened. The U.S. government has, in a way, defaulted. Money as you knew it has ceased to exist. You think to yourself, this can't be good. You walk onto the trading floor the next morning expecting absolute chaos, a sea of red as the market crashes. And there is chaos, but it's not the kind you expected. Instead of falling, the stock market explodes upward, jumping nearly 4%. The dollar plummets, but stocks soar. You're completely shocked. Nothing in your short lifetime could have prepared you for this. It makes no sense. This is the exact experience that set a young Ray Dalio on a lifelong quest. That shock, that confusion, was the first of many painful surprises that taught him a vital lesson. The biggest mistakes in life and in markets come from missing the massive shifts that have never happened in your lifetime, but have happened countless times throughout history. Dalio, the founder of the world's largest hedge fund, Bridgewater Associates, realized he couldn't just study the recent past. He had to become a student of history, a detective searching for the timeless and universal patterns that govern the rises and falls of nations, economies, and empires. What he discovered is the subject of his monumental book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. And what he found is that history isn't just a random collection of stories. It's a machine, a perpetual motion machine with clear cause and effect relationships that repeat in great, sweeping cycles. He found that the turbulent times we're living in today, with massive debts, deep political divisions, and a rising new world power challenging the old, are not new. They are, in fact, classic signs of a rare and dangerous phase in a cycle that has repeated for the last 500 years. In this summary, I'm going to share the map that Ray Dalio has created for us. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a look under the hood of the world, revealing the fundamental mechanics that drive everything from your personal finances to the fate of nations. By the end of our time together, you will understand the great cycle of history. You will see where we are in it right now, and you will be armed with a new perspective to navigate the radically different times that lie ahead. Book summary. To understand the world, we first have to zoom out, way out. We are like ants, so preoccupied with our daily task of carrying crumbs that we fail to see the larger patterns around us. We see our brief lifetime as the entirety of reality, believing the future will be a slightly modified version of the recent past. But this, Dalio tells us, is one of the most dangerous mistakes we can make. The truly great booms and the truly terrible busts, the periods of peace and the periods of war, come along about once in a lifetime. They always feel new and shocking to the people living through them. But if you zoom out and look at history over hundreds of years, you see them for what they are: predictable phases in a grand, repeating pattern. Dalio calls this pattern the big cycle. So, what is the big cycle? Think of it like the life of a great empire. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A typical cycle lasts for about 250 years, give or take 150 years. It begins after a major conflict, a war or a revolution, establishes a new world order, with a new dominant power setting the rules. This leads to a period of peace and prosperity. This is the rise. During the rise, the country is fundamentally strong. It has low debt, people are working together effectively, and its leadership is strong and capable. Crucially, it invests heavily in education and infrastructure. This strong education fosters a culture of civility, a strong work ethic, and low corruption. Most importantly, it leads to innovation. New technologies are invented. The country becomes more competitive on the world stage. This virtuous cycle feeds on itself. As the nation becomes more productive and trades more with the world, its income grows. To support this, It develops the world's leading financial centers. Think of Amsterdam in the 1600s, London in the 1800s, and New York in the 20th century. Eventually, its currency becomes the world's reserve currency, the currency most used for international trade and savings. This is an immense power, an exorbitant privilege, because it allows the country to borrow much more than anyone else. This leads to the top. At its peak, the empire seems invincible. Its people are earning more, which makes them more expensive workers. They start to enjoy more leisure and perhaps work a little less hard. The children and grandchildren of those who fought to build the empire inherit wealth, but not the grit and resilience of their ancestors. They are accustomed to the easy life, steeped in luxury, and more vulnerable to challenges. This is also when the seeds of decline are sown. Because everyone gets used to the good times continuing, they borrow more and more money to bet on it, leading to financial bubbles. As the country gets richer, the gap between the rich haves and the poor have-nots grows wider. The system starts to feel unfair to those being left behind, and resentments build. Meanwhile, having the world's reserve currency allows the empire to borrow excessively to finance its overconsumption and the military conflicts required to maintain its dominance. It appears powerful, but its finances are secretly weakening. One of the earliest signs of a power shift is when the rich, leading empire starts borrowing heavily from poorer, rising countries that have higher savings rates. This is exactly what started happening in the 1980s, when the US began borrowing from a much poorer China. Finally, this leads to the decline. This is the painful period of fighting and restructuring. The decline often comes gradually, then suddenly. Debts have become too large to be paid back. When an economic downturn hits, the government is forced to choose between defaulting or printing massive amounts of money. It almost always chooses to print money. This devalues the currency, which hurts savers and anyone holding the country's debt. At the same time, the huge wealth gaps and economic pain lead to intense internal conflict. The rich and the poor, the left and the right, fight over a shrinking economic pie. This is when you see the rise of populism. Leaders emerge from both sides, promising to take control and bring order to the chaos. Democracy itself becomes challenged, as people become willing to trade freedoms for a strong leader who can end the anarchy. As the empire is tearing itself apart from within, it also faces a challenge from without, a rising rival power, which has been building its strength while the old power grew complacent, now has a comparable military and economy. Seeing the internal weakness of the dominant power, the rising power becomes bolder. This leads to a series of conflicts, trade wars, technology wars, geopolitical struggles, and eventually, the risk of a military war. When all these forces line up, the massive debts, the money printing, the internal civil war or revolution, and the war abroad, the big cycle reaches its end. Faith in the currency is lost. The old world order crumbles, and after a period of terrible conflict, a new winner emerges, a new world order is established, and the cycle begins all over again. This entire sequence is driven by a handful of key determinants of power that rise and fall together. Dalio identifies 8 primary measures: education, innovation and technology, competitiveness, economic output, world trade share, military strength, financial center strength, and reserve currency status. The pattern is remarkably consistent. A country's rise begins with strong education. This leads to higher innovation, which makes it more competitive. Its share of world trade grows, its economy becomes the largest, and it builds a powerful military to protect its interests. As a result, its financial centers become dominant, and eventually, its currency is adopted as the world's reserve currency. The decline happens in a similar, but reverse, order. The last thing to go is the reserve currency, which tends to stick around out of habit long after the underlying strengths have faded. This isn't just a theory, it's a story written in the data of the last 500 years. Dalio's study focuses on the last 3 great reserve currency empires, the Dutch, the British, and the Americans, as well as the remarkable rise of China. The Dutch Empire rose in the early 1600s after breaking free from Spain. They were a small country, but they were superbly educated, inventive, and hard-working. They invented modern capitalism, creating the world's first publicly traded company, the Dutch East India Company, and the first stock exchange. They created ships that could travel the globe and a powerful navy to protect their trade routes. Their currency, the guilder, became the world's first global reserve currency, backed by the innovative Bank of Amsterdam. They were at the top of the world. But by the 1700s, the classic signs of decline appeared. The Dutch had become rich and less competitive. Their wages were high, and they had failed to keep up with the next wave of innovation, the Industrial Revolution, which was beginning in Britain. They got into a series of costly wars to protect their empire, most importantly against the rising British. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War was a devastating defeat. To finance its debts, the Bank of Amsterdam started printing money to bail out the too-big-to-fail Dutch East India Company. This led to a classic run on the bank, a devaluation of the guilder, and the end of its reserve currency status. The British pound took its place. The British Empire followed the exact same script, just on a grander scale. Its rise was fueled by strong education, the scientific revolution, and then the Industrial Revolution. It developed the world's most powerful navy, which allowed it to build a colossal global empire. London became the world's financial center, and the pound sterling became the dominant reserve currency. At its peak around 1900, the British Empire controlled over 25% of the world's population and landmass. But again, the seeds of decline were already sprouting. The UK failed to keep up with the Second Industrial Revolution, which was being led by rising powers, Germany and the United States. Britain became less competitive, its education system lagged, and it was overextended, fighting costly wars to maintain its empire. The two world wars, though Britain was on the winning side, left it effectively bankrupt, with enormous debts owed to the United States. The decline of the pound was a slow, painful process, marked by several major devaluations in 1949 and 1967. Finally, its empire dissolved, and the US dollar definitively took the pound's place as the world's dominant reserve currency. This brings us to the American Empire. The US rose for all the classic reasons. It had abundant natural resources, was protected by two oceans, and most importantly, it built a culture that valued strong education, innovation, and a powerful work ethic. It went through its own internal conflicts, most notably the Civil War, but emerged stronger. It led the Second Industrial Revolution and became the world's most dominant economic and technological power. After World War II, the New World Order was undeniably American. The U.S. held two-thirds of the world's gold, accounted for half of world production, and had a monopoly on nuclear weapons. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 formally established the dollar, linked to gold, as the center of the global monetary system. New York became the undisputed financial capital of the world. This ushered in a long period of peace and prosperity, the one most of us have lived our entire lives in. But since its peak around the 1950s, the U.S. has been showing the classic, slow-moving signs of an empire in the later stages of its cycle. Its competitiveness has declined as manufacturing jobs moved to cheaper countries. Its education system has fallen in relative rankings. It has become the world's largest debtor nation, borrowing immense sums to finance its spending. And, most visibly, its internal conflicts have intensified, with wealth, values, and political gaps growing to their largest levels since the 1930s. The cycle of money and credit is at the heart of this story. Dalio explains that all monetary systems in history move through a predictable cycle. It starts with Type 1 money, hard money, like gold or silver coins. This is the most restrictive system because you can't just create more of it. This evolves into Type 2 money, claims on hard money, like paper notes that promise you can exchange them for gold. This system allows for the creation of credit, which fuels economic booms. But it always leads to the same problem. The claims on hard money debt grow much faster than the actual hard money in the bank. Eventually, people realize this and rush to exchange their paper for gold. This is the run on the bank. This forces the government to break its promise, which leads to Type 3 money, fiat money. This is the system we have today, where money is not backed by anything but government decree. This gives the central bank the freedom to print unlimited amounts of money to stimulate the economy and manage debt crises. But this freedom is also its greatest risk. Over time, the constant printing of money to solve problems devalues the currency. People lose faith in it as a store of wealth, and this eventually leads to the breakdown of the monetary system and a flight back to hard assets, starting the cycle over again. We saw this happen in the U.S. The Bretton Woods system was a Type II system. Dollars were claims on gold. The U.S. printed far more paper dollar claims than it had gold to back them up, largely to finance the Vietnam War and domestic social programs. In 1971, when other countries came to collect their gold, President Nixon had to sever the link. The world moved to a fiat dollar system. Since then, and especially after the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic, the U.S. has created unprecedented amounts of money and debt to stimulate its economy. Interest rates are at or near zero, meaning you get paid nothing to save your money. This brings us to the final and most critical piece of the puzzle: the rise of China. For most of the last 2,000 years, China was one of the world's most powerful and advanced empires. Its history is a series of its own big cycles, with dynasties rising and falling for the same reasons Dalio identifies in the West. But from roughly 1840 to 1949, it entered a severe decline, a period the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation. It was weakened from within by corruption and rebellion, and exploited from without by stronger Western powers and Japan. The Communist Revolution in 1949 established a new order under Mao Zedong. After Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping initiated the reform and opening up policies in 1978. This was a brilliant strategy. Deng understood that to become rich and powerful, China needed to embrace market principles and learn from the outside world, but he did so under the guiding principle to hide your strength, bide your time. Over the last 40 years, China has executed the most remarkable economic rise in history. It has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It followed the classic playbook of a rising power perfectly. It invested massively in education and infrastructure. Its people have an incredibly strong work ethic and a deep respect for learning from history. It became the world's manufacturing powerhouse, accumulating huge savings and becoming the largest creditor to the United States. Now, it is rapidly catching up to, and in some areas surpassing, the U.S. in technology, with clear ambitions to lead in areas like artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Today, we are in a classic stage 5 of the big cycle. We have a dominant but declining and heavily indebted world power, the United States, which is suffering from large and growing internal conflicts, and we have a rapidly rising rival power, China, which is becoming comparable in strength across all the key metrics. This has led to the 5 types of wars that Dalio describes as typical for this stage. First, the trade war. Conflicts over tariffs and market access, as the declining power tries to protect its industries from the more competitive rising power. Second, the technology war. A battle for supremacy in the key technologies that will define the future. This is the most important war, because the winner will likely win all the others. The U.S. is attempting to cut China off from key technologies like advanced semiconductors, while China is racing to become self-sufficient. Third, the geopolitical war. A struggle for influence over other countries and territories. We see this playing out in the South China Sea, and especially over the fate of Taiwan. Dalio notes that a conflict over Taiwan could be the trigger for a military confrontation, much like past conflicts that pushed rival powers over the brink. Fourth, the capital war. Using financial power as a weapon, through sanctions and attempts to limit access to capital. The U.S.'s greatest power here is the dominance of the dollar, but using it as a weapon encourages other countries, like China and Russia, to find alternatives, which could hasten the dollar's decline. And finally, the risk of a military war. Dalio is clear that this is the worst-case scenario. Such a war between 2 nuclear powers would be unimaginably horrible. He stresses that these wars often happen not because leaders are evil, but because of a tit-for-tat escalation where neither side can afford to look weak. A declining empire, especially, tends to fight more than is logical because any retreat is seen as a humiliating defeat. But perhaps the most important war, Dalio concludes, is the war with ourselves. The fate of any country is not ultimately decided by an external enemy, but by its own internal health. Can it maintain a high-quality education system? Can it keep its finances in order? Can it invest in its future? And most importantly, can its people work together civilly, respecting the rules and each other, to solve their common problems? These are the questions that will determine the future of the United States, China, and the world order they will create together. Commentary. Reading The Changing World Order is like putting on a pair of glasses for the first time and seeing the blurry chaos of current events snap into sharp, clear focus. Suddenly, you see that the headlines about trade wars, political polarization, and the rise of new technologies aren't just random noise. They are notes in a symphony that has been playing for centuries. Ray Dalio gives us the sheet music. The most powerful, and perhaps unsettling takeaway from this book is the profound realization of where we stand in this great historical cycle. We are not in ordinary times. We are living through a tectonic shift, a transition between world orders that has historically been accompanied by tremendous conflict and upheaval. The confluence of the three great forces Dalio identifies: the end of a long-term debt cycle, the peak of internal political and social conflict within the U.S., and the rise of a powerful rival in China, creates a situation analogous to the 1930 to 1945 period. This isn't meant to be a terrifying prophecy, but a sobering call to awareness. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes, and the rhyme we're hearing right now is a familiar and dangerous one. What this book does so brilliantly is to replace fear with understanding. By seeing these events as part of a predictable, mechanical process, we can move beyond emotional reactions and begin to think strategically. The book is a testament to the power of principles. Just as a pilot uses a checklist and an understanding of aerodynamics to fly a plane, Dalio argues that we can use the timeless principles of history to navigate our lives and our societies. So what can you, as an ambitious young person looking out at this changing world, do with this knowledge? First, adopt a wider lens. Don't just consume the news of the day. When you see a major event, ask yourself the question that drove Dalio's entire study: when has this happened before? Start to think like a historian. Understand that the world you were born into is not permanent. The rules, the powers, and the orders are all in flux. This perspective will give you a sense of calm and clarity that is impossible to have when you're caught in the blizzard of the present moment. Second, understand the changing value of money. This might be the most practical and urgent lesson in the book. We are taught to focus on earning money, but we rarely think about the value of that money. We are in a period where central banks are printing unprecedented amounts of it, and interest rates are near zero. This classic late-cycle environment means that holding cash or bonds is likely a losing proposition. Their value will be eroded by inflation. This doesn't mean you should panic. It means you should become a student of how different assets, stocks, real estate, commodities like gold, and even new technologies, perform during periods of currency devaluation. Understanding this cycle is fundamental to building and preserving wealth in the decades to come. Third, and most importantly, focus on what is timeless. The war with ourselves is the only one we have complete control over. The principles that make a country strong are the same principles that make an individual strong. Invest in your education. Always be learning. Be productive and create more value than you consume. Manage your finances wisely, avoiding excessive debt. Be civil and work well with others. And be adaptable, because the one certainty is that the world will change in ways we cannot predict. Your resilience and your character will be your greatest assets. That was a summary of Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order by Ray Dalio. We've journeyed through the great cycles of history today, but I'll be honest with you. A summary can only show you the map. The real adventure happens when you explore the terrain yourself. The true power of this book is in the depth of its historical stories and the quiet moments of reflection they inspire. This summary is designed to help you decide if this perspective is worth your time. If the grand sweep of history and the mechanics of power have sparked your curiosity, then grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning facts. It's about acquiring a new way of seeing the world that can fundamentally change how you prepare for your future. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this journey through history valuable, please take a moment to click that like button and subscribe to our channel, Billionaire's Bookshelf. It helps us reach more curious minds like yours, and ensures you won't miss our next deep dive into another world-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.